My name's Emma, and my husband is Jack. We have a 20-year-old son, Lamb, who's away at college right now. We've been scrimping and saving for years to keep him there, cutting corners, skipping vacations, you name it. Also, he could have a shot at something bigger. We live in the house my grandmother left us when she moved into a nursing home. It's large and comfortable, but nothing fancy. It just feels like home. Jack works at the local hardware store, and I manage the front desk at a doctor's office. We make do, living the simple life, and that's just fine by us. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sun hanging just right, making you think about calling it a day early. But then Jack's phone rang, cutting through any thoughts of an early weekend. I was chopping carrots, half focused on dinner and half on a list of bills that needed paying, when I heard him answer. "Hello, Mom." "Slow down. What's wrong?" His face went white as he listened. I stopped what I was doing, towel in hand, watching him pace. He ended the call looking shaken. "That was my dad," he said, sinking into the couch like a puppet with its strings cut. "Their business tanked. Bankrupt. They've lost everything, even the house." My heart sank. "Oh, Jack, that's terrible. What are they planning to do?" "They want to come stay with us. Just for a bit," they said, "until they sort something out." I hesitated, thinking about our already tight budget and the quiet order of our life that was about to be upended. "And what did you tell them?" He rubbed his neck, a sure sign he was stressed. "Told them I'd talk to you first. It's your house, Emma. Wouldn't just spring that on you without checking." Jack's parents, Frank and Helen, weren't the easygoing type, high flyers used to the good life. Our simple setup was miles from what they were accustomed to. "You know how they are, Jack. This house, it isn't their style." I know, he looked uneasy. "But they're my folks, Em. They're stuck." I thought about all the times they visited, noses turned up at our modest living. It was clear they'd be like fish out of water here. But then, picturing them desperate enough to ask for help, my resolve softened. "All right, they can come, but it's temporary, right? Just until they're back on their feet." Jack picked up his phone, dialed, and after a short muffled exchange, said, "Mom, Emma and I talked it over. You can stay here for a bit, but just until you find a place." "Got it. We're not running a hotel." I couldn't hear what was said on the other end, but Jack's tight-lipped, "Yes, Mom, we're clear," gave me the gist. He hung up and exhaled long and hard. "They're thankful, Em. They'll be here next week." Last week, Jack told his folks they could stay with us for a bit, and today, they were moving in. I watched from the porch as two huge trucks rolled up our driveway, and I swear my heart sank. Jack was out there directing traffic like some parking lot attendant, trying to keep a smile plastered on his face. Frank was the first to barrel out of the car, a big grin on his face, clapping Jack on the back so hard you'd think he'd won the lottery and not just moved into his son's house. "Emma, darling." Helen swept up to me, all perfumed and peppy, planting a kiss on my cheek that felt more like a branding iron. "You're an angel for letting us invade like this." I forced a smile, my eyes darting to the mountain of stuff they were unloading. "It's no problem, Helen, but is this all of it?" "Oh, this is just the essentials." She waved a dismissive hand as if the pile of furniture and boxes wasn't already swallowing our front yard. "The rest we put in storage." Essentials. I bit my tongue to keep from saying anything rash. If these were essentials, I dreaded to think what they'd left behind. Jack caught my eye, and I could tell he was thinking the same thing. "Let's get this stuff inside then," Jack said, more to himself than anyone else. Frank and Helen directed the movers with the kind of authority that made you think they were moving into a palace, not our modest little home. The movers shuffled past, hauling in armchairs, countless boxes, and would you believe it, a grandfather clock. Who needs a grandfather clock in their temporary home? "Right there, boys. Just set it all there," Frank directed, pointing at various spots around our living room, which was rapidly disappearing under a sea of their belongings. I pulled Jack aside while the movers took a breather. "Jack, this is crazy. They brought enough to furnish a whole house. Where are we going to put all this?" Jack rubbed his temples. I know. I'll talk to them. Okay, let's just get through today." We retreated as the movers continued their work. The whole ground floor was turning into a replica of Frank and Helen's old house, every corner filled, every space taken over. By the time the movers were done, our once cozy living room looked more like a storage unit. Dinner that night was a chaotic affair. We barely found the table under all the clutter. Frank and Helen seemed oblivious to the mess, chatting away about their journey here. Emma, you really should try this wine, Frank said, popping open a bottle of something French and probably more expensive than our entire grocery budget for the week. We're so grateful to you both, Helen chimed in, her voice sugary enough to give you cavities. It's just till we find our feet. Yeah, about that, Jack started, clearing his throat. We need to talk about some ground rules. Space is tight and… Oh, don't worry about it, son, Frank waved him off. We'll manage just fine, won't we, dear? He smiled at Helen, who nodded enthusiastically. I glanced around at our cluttered space, the piles of boxes and the fancy ornaments that crowded out our simple decorations. Managed just fine? I wasn't so sure about that. Living with Frank and Helen had been an adjustment, to put it mildly. A few days had passed since they moved in, and just when I thought we'd settled into some sort of routine, the kitchen became the new battleground. It was a Tuesday evening, and I was preparing dinner as usual, something simple and hearty, spaghetti with homemade tomato sauce. As I stirred the pot, Helen walked into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling as if she'd just walked into a barn. What's that smell? She asked, her tone dripping with disdain. It's dinner, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Spaghetti night. Spaghetti, she scoffed, peering over my shoulder. Where's the meat? The fresh herbs? This is what you feed us. Jack, hearing the commotion, wandered in, drying his hands on a dish towel. What's the problem? His mom turned to him with a look that could curdle milk. The problem, Jack, is that we're expected to eat this, she said, gesturing at the bubbling pot as if it were a cauldron of poison. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It's what we usually eat. We can't afford steaks and fancy meals every night. Jack stepped between us, his face set in hard lines. Mom, this is Emma's house, and this is what we eat. If you want something else, you're welcome to cook for yourselves. Oh, we will? Helen retorted, her eyes narrowing. And we expect you to provide the groceries we require. We're not used to living like this. I had had enough. Look, I'm sorry you're used to different, but this is what we can manage. Our budget doesn't stretch to luxuries. Frank, who had been silent until now, boomed, then perhaps you need to reevaluate your budget. We're not animals to be fed on scraps. Jack's jaw clenched. Dad, that's enough. We're doing the best we can. The room was thick with tension, everyone's shoulders hunched. Finally, Helen huffed, Fine, tomorrow we'll give you a list of what we eat. You can make sure it's here the next day. True to her word, Helen handed me a list the next day. Marbled beef, fresh seafood, organic this, imported that. I looked at the list, my heart sinking. That evening, we sat down with Frank and Helen, the list between us on the kitchen table. We expect proper meals, steaks, marbled beef, or the finest fish, Frank declared, as if it were the most normal request in the world. Jack and I exchanged shocked looks. We can't swing that, he said, his voice firm but weary. That's just not in our budget. Their response was swift and harsh. Lazy, both of you, Helen snapped. Can't even provide a decent meal. Feeling cornered, I caved to their demands. I started buying only the highest quality products for them while Jack and I got by on fast food to save costs. A month later, the strain was beginning to show. I sat down to crunch the numbers and my heart nearly stopped. Our food expenses had doubled and Helen's indulgent baths had sent our water bill soaring. Dinner had become a battlefield, but tonight was different. Frank and Helen were luxuriating over marbled steaks and imported fish they'd insisted on buying, while Jack and I sat across from them with our simple pasta, what we could afford. The disparity was more than just on our plates. It was deepening the divide between us. As they savored their extravagant meals, I couldn't hold back any longer. This has got to stop, I said, my voice heavy with frustration. Helen looked up, fork halfway to her mouth. What are you talking about now? We can't keep living like this, eating separately and having different meals, I said. It's ridiculous. From now on, everyone in this house eats the same, and we stick to what we can afford. Frank's laughter was a harsh sound that grated on my nerves. You expect us to eat that slop. It's not slop, it's dinner. It's what we eat. I shot back, my patience fraying. The laughter vanished from Frank's face, replaced by a scowl. Helen's tone was sharp and accusing. How can you be so greedy and lazy? Cooking decent food isn't that hard. They both turned to Jack, their expressions filled with expectation. You're going to let her talk to us like this in your own house. That was the last straw. Jack's hand slammed down on the table, making the plates jump. First off, this is Emma's house and you will treat her with respect. The impact of his words hit hard. Helen's eyes filled with tears, her voice quivering. I never expected you to raise your voice at me, your own mother. Frank's anger boiled over. He stood, pointing an accusing finger at Jack. Look at you, henpecked and dancing to her tune. Is this what you've become? I stood my ground, though my heart was pounding. Enough. This conversation is over. From today, no more expensive steaks or fish. We eat the same, all of us. Their looks could have frozen the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without a word, Frank and Helen pushed back from the table and left. Jack and I sat back down, the silence hanging heavy between us. He reached for my hand, squeezing it tightly. I'm sorry it had to come to this. I am too, I replied, feeling the weight of the evening settle around us. But it's the right thing. We can't live like this. After the blow-up at dinner, things cooled down, but only on the surface. Frank and Helen were quieter, sure, but there was a coldness to their silence that kept me on edge. I had a feeling Frank and Helen wouldn't accept the new house rules without resistance, and I was right. It started subtly a few days later. I was cleaning up after a lunch of sandwiches when the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on a towel and headed to the front door, expecting perhaps a package or a neighbor. When I opened it, a delivery guy stood there with a large aromatic bag from a high-end restaurant in town. Delivery for Emma, he said, glancing at his clipboard. I was puzzled. There must be some mistake. I didn't order this. Helen appeared behind me, her smile a bit too wide. Oh, I took the liberty of ordering us a nice meal. I thought we deserved a treat after all the recent discomfort. I frowned, taking the bag hesitantly. Helen, we talked about this. We're cutting back on expenses. Helen shrugged, her eyes avoiding mine. I thought it was on your tab, dear. My mistake. Jack walked in from the kitchen, overhearing us. What's going on? Your mother decided we deserved an expensive lunch, I said, the weight of the bag suddenly feeling heavier. Jack's expression hardened. Mom, we agreed no more of this. Frank stepped into the hallway, his voice booming. What's a little lunch going to hurt? You can't expect us to live like monks forever. I set the bag down on my entryway table, frustration bubbling up. It's not just about lunch, it's every meal, every extra expense. We told you we're sticking to a budget. Helen's face turned cold. Well, if you're going to make such a fuss over a simple meal, I suppose we won't bother next time. Jack pinched the bridge of his nose. It's not just about the meal. It's about respecting the rules of the house. You can't keep going behind our backs. The conversation spiraled in circles until Frank and Helen retreated to their room, leaving the uneaten expensive lunch on the table. Jack and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement that this situation couldn't continue. I'll call the restaurant, explain the situation, and cancel any future orders made without our consent, I said, picking up the phone. Jack nodded, his jaw set. I'll talk to them again. This sneaky stuff has to stop. The uneasy peace was short-lived. After the unauthorized lunch incident, Helen and Frank's simmering discontent was palpable, and the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. That evening, as I was washing dishes, the calm was shattered once again. Jack had just come in from the yard, looking weary. I was about to ask him about his day when a loud crash from the living room had us both running. We found Frank standing over a broken vase, one of the few decorations we had left. Jack's voice was steady but tinged with frustration. I really care about what happens here. Frank barely glanced up, his expression showing minimal regret. It slipped, he said dismissively. His tone wasn't apologetic, it was defiant. Jack bent down to pick up the shattered pieces of the vase, and I couldn't help but add, that vase belonged to my grandmother. It's been here longer than I have. Helen, standing in the doorway, scoffed. It's just a vase. You can always get another. That's not the point, Helen, I snapped, my frustration rising. The point is respect, something that's clearly lacking here. Oh, respect? Frank shot back, his voice raising. What about respecting us? Treating us like second-class citizens in this house? Jack stood up, facing his father with a firm expression. You're living here by our goodwill, Dad. Remember that. It doesn't feel like goodwill. Helen chimed in, her words sharp. It feels like we're unwelcome. Every day felt like walking a tightrope with Frank and Helen in our house, but one evening pushed me past my breaking point. We were gathered around the dinner table, a place that had witnessed countless arguments. when Helen casually dropped her latest bombshell. Jack, darling, she said as if suggesting we switch coffee brands, I found this lovely coat today, and I think we should buy it using the college fund you've set up for Liam. I choked on my water, setting my glass down hard on the table. What did you just say? I managed, my voice a mix of disbelief and rising anger. Helen smiled sweetly, clearly mistaking my shock for compliance. It's just money, dear. Liam can always take out loans for college. I really need a new coat. Jack, who had been quietly seething beside me, slammed his fork down. Mom, that's out of the question. That money is for our son's education. We're not using it for anything else. Helen's face twisted into a scowl. How can you deny your own mother a simple request? It's not simple, and that's final, I snapped, feeling the last of my patience evaporate. Frank's voice rose to a shout. You're both being unreasonable and cruel. We're your family. Then, with a cold, calculated tone, he added, maybe the local press would be interested to know how you treat your family. What about your bosses? Frank demanded, his voice dripping with menace. I felt a churn of fury and fear in my stomach, but I knew we couldn't back down. This is not how a family treats each other, I shot back, standing firm. You two need to find another place to live. This isn't working. Helen burst into tears, playing the victim while Frank continued to hurl accusations and threats. The dinner ended with them storming out, leaving Jack and me in stunned silence. Once the house was quiet, I retreated to the bedroom and dialed my grandmother. She answered after a few rings, her voice a soothing balm. Grandma, it's Emma, I said, my voice thick with emotion. What's wrong, dear? She asked, her tone immediately alert. I poured out everything, the demands, the threats, the impossible situation with Helen and Frank. She listened without interrupting, her steady hum of reassurance in the background. When I finished, there was a brief pause before she said decisively, I'll come to stay with you for a couple of months. Are you sure, Grandma? What about the nursing home? I'm sure, she replied firmly. It sounds like you need me there, and I'm not one to sit by when my family is in trouble. When Grandma arrived, it was like a breath of fresh air swept through the house. Despite her age and slower movements, her spirit was as fiery as ever. Frank and Helen were visibly put off by her sudden presence, their discomfort unmistakable. I'll be staying on the ground floor, Grandma declared firmly as she rolled through the door, her suitcase trailing behind like a loyal companion. I expect some things will need to be moved. Frank tried to mask his irritation with a forced smile. Of course, we'll make you comfortable. Helen nodded stiffly, her eyes darting around as if calculating what would need to be shifted or hidden away. I couldn't help but feel a surge of relief. Finally, someone was putting them in their place. As soon as the movers finished rearranging the furniture, Grandma called a family meeting in the living room. I've heard quite a bit from Emma about what's been going on here, and I'm not pleased, she began, her tone stern and cutting through any pretense of pleasantries. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but Grandma raised her hand, silencing him. I'm not done. This house is still technically mine, and while I've allowed Emma and Jack to live here without rent, that doesn't extend to you too. Helen's face went pale. You want us to pay rent? She sputtered. Yes, Grandma stated flatly. $4,000 a month. That's outrageous, Frank exclaimed, standing up from his chair. We can't afford that. Well, considering the costs you've been racking up here, I'd say you can afford to cut back on your luxuries, Grandma shot back. But we're family. Helen tried, her voice quivering slightly. Family doesn't exploit each other, Grandma countered firmly. Since you've been enjoying a lifestyle beyond your means on my granddaughter's dime, it's time you start contributing. I think it's only fair, Grandma said firmly. Frank and Helen exchanged glances, their faces betraying their shock as they searched for an escape that wasn't there. And one more thing, Grandma continued, her tone unyielding. If you think the rent is too high, you're welcome to find somewhere else to live. If you decide to stay, you'll need to provide daily assistance, helping me get around, preparing meals, and ensuring I'm well cared for. Helen's mouth moved up and down like a fish gasping for air, her earlier bravado completely vanishing. Frank, who had always prided himself on his independence, looked as though he'd been punched in the gut. Think it over, Grandma said, her voice softening just a touch. I'll need your answer by tomorrow morning. As they retreated to their room, presumably to discuss their limited options, Grandma turned to us with a reassuring smile. Don't you worry, kids. We'll sort this mess out. The following morning, Grandma's new rules seemed to have flipped a switch in Frank and Helen. I walked into the kitchen to find them packing their things, a pile of boxes already forming by the door. "We've decided to move out," Frank announced, not looking up from the box he was sealing. "We found a small apartment. We'll take our things and go." Helen was quieter, busily stuffing items into bags with sharp, quick movements. "It's for the best," she muttered almost to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. The rest of the morning was a blur of activity, boxes and furniture moving out the door. Jack helped more out of duty than anything else. By mid-afternoon, their part of the house was eerily empty, the echo of their departure hanging in the air. Once they had driven off, Grandma, who had been watching quietly from her chair, gave me a knowing look. "Well, that's that then. They'll be all right. Sometimes a little hardship is needed to bring people back to earth." We later learned that Frank and Helen had sold most of their belongings to cover the rent and their other debts. Their luxurious lifestyle had been trimmed down to essentials, much like their new apartment. Grandma stayed with us for another 2 weeks, a comforting presence in the house. When it was time for her to return to the nursing home, I felt a mix of sadness and relief. "Thanks for everything, Grandma. We couldn't have managed without you," I said, driving her back. She waved off my thanks with a chuckle. "Oh, nonsense. You're stronger than you think. Just remember to stand up for yourselves. No one else will do it for you." After saying my goodbyes and promising to visit soon, I returned home to find the house seemed bigger and quieter. That night, Jack and I sat on the porch, the cool, pleasant evening air racking around us. Life had thrown us a curveball, but we had caught it, dealt with it, and were ready to face whatever came next. We knew we could handle it together, with or without anyone else's approval.